Alright everybody, so today basically what I want to do is talk about Kdin Jenzen's post that she made about the Clover situation and tangentially related like the Crow and Clover situation from last volume, and that is still ongoing in a way this volume. But before we get into that, like you guys may be wondering where Hunter is. Like, here's some more information about me and Hunter if you guys don't know. But yeah, you guys may be wondering, like, usually I have Hunter and like all my RWBY conversations, but especially when we are talking about LGBT stuff, because we both come from very different perspectives. But the recording that we made, like, we already had this conversation and the recording got fucked up, and I'm very angry about that. But yeah, there's not very much that we can do about that. So basically I'm recording it by myself, but I mentioned this because I just want you guys to know that Hunter has like co-signed this, I guess. Like, basically what I'm going to be saying is not only like my opinion, but it is also stuff that we talked about together. So it is basically like our opinions that we want to share with you guys today. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to redirect quotes from the post, but then I'm going to summarize other parts. You guys should go into the pinned comment section because I will pin Kdin's post in there so you guys can read it for yourselves, because I think that's very, very important that we do not do a broken telephone with her words and that we actually like read and understand what she's saying. I've read it multiple times out loud in my head, right? But yeah, you guys should read it as well. So this was the question that was sent to Kdin, and it says, how can you continue to support and advertise in good conscience for a company that has repeatedly baited and insulted its LGBT plus fan base, especially after they had Robin basically lie about Clover's supposed flaws to berate Crow, and on a meta level, the audience that were mourning the representation that they were explicitly promised for feeling sad about his death. So with that, there's a lot to unpack there and a lot I disagree with, but first we're going to talk about what Kdin said. And so she splits it up into like first, second, third, fourth, and so I'm basically going to summarize, right? She says, Clover was never written as gay or a love interest for Crow at any point of his conception, Clover's conception. Clover was never ever stated to be explicitly promised representation for the MLM community. There's no documentation of this anywhere. There's no draft where he was. None of that is true at all in any way, shape, or form. Then 3, she understands how misunderstandings like this can hurt people, but that's why, in her view, right, CRWBY tried to immediately like clear up this misunderstanding. Then 4, as the voice of a character that is blatantly stated an explicitly promised bit of representation for an entirely underrepresented community of people, it's extremely frustrating to see a character that was never intended to be seen as, and surely was never actually written as, a representation for a marginalized group of people being held up as an example of representation, while my own character, who actually is a real example of representation, being constantly demonized and overlooked. There's a lot that Kdin talks about, like transphobic things that have been said about May, right? And so I would like to get into that, but like in a whole other video, because I think that that deserves like its own conversation, especially with Hunter here. I think that we should keep that for another day, but I think that is something to keep in mind as well, like the vitriol that has been thrown Kdin's way, and like the transphobic things said, such as like, oh, well, Robin looks more manly, so Robin should be the trans one, and apparently no one sees what's problematic about that. So we'll definitely get into that another day, because that stuff is disgusting. And then she says, 5th, the cast and crew of the show, including myself, have received more death threats about this than I think most of you care to actually acknowledge. And then she goes on to say, you asked, how can you support and advertise in good conscience for a company that has repeatedly baited and insulted its LGBT fan base? The answer is because the actual representation for the LGBTQIA community that was explicitly stated and promised was actually handled incredibly well, had time and care put into it, and was thought about from concept to design to casting to written dialogue, and that representation was not hidden and not coded, but blatantly stated by both the creators outside and inside of canon, and proudly on display in the show. And then she also goes on to talk about how like people behind the scenes, that they have like basically fought for her like in a tangible, real way. Clover being MLM was always just a headcanon that the fandom leaned into. It was never ever stated to be canon at any point during production or the creation of the character. And I think that this last part is actually really important. It is desperately hurtful to have poured so much work into having a character that is actually representative, and a promised one at that, of a marginalized group entirely ignored by the community because of a headcanon for another character, and in doing so has only made that that very rare bit of representation feel ironically invisible. And so I would like to say a few things, okay? I think that Hunter and I completely agree with Kdin. I think there are some things that, you know, we have talked about in the past, right? Like people may be like, but, you know, the marketing team did this and the social media team did that, right? And they may bring that up as evidence to like contrary to the point that the crew did not lead them on. But what people need to understand, and Hunter and I said that the first time, what people need to understand is that the social media and the marketing team, they are not CRWBY. And you could argue, oh, CRWBY has to reel them in, but they do not necessarily have the authority to do so, right? And I think, like, to me, it's very obvious, especially now, that the people that are running the RWBY Twitter account, I'm just gonna say it, if you see what they've been posting, they are like literal boomers, okay? They don't engage with the fandom's memes at all. They don't engage to like such an extent of what's actually happening in the show. They just post like, oh, you know, Salem zooming, like me when I like leave my chicken nuggets in the microwave or whatever. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's such like cringy boomer shit. There's such a disconnect between the social media account and the people that actually care about the show that you should not blame CRWBY for what happened in that aspect. You should hold them accountable, like the social media people, but like CRWBY didn't do that. And I know that other people have said, well, you know, the animators said this, or, you know, like this animator drew fan art in their spare time, right? And so I think that we need to unpack that. Like, first of all, I think that the animator that they're talking about wasn't with the company anymore, was the first thing. And second, like, made similar comments about other stuff, because at that point they weren't necessarily like an animator, they were a fan. So like they talked about Iron Crow, but somehow that didn't snowball out of control to the same extent this did. And the poor person that made the fan art, like they can't just make fan art on their own time. And so I feel like the first problem that Hunter and I want to address is the overanalyzation that the fandom has, looking at everyone's tweets with a microscope. And I understand, because we're guilty of it too, right? Like, we've done it, you know? Like, there was this whole thing of like, oh, the concept artist for Nora's outfits liked a post saying that Nora was trans. Like, could that be a thing, right? And so like we've been guilty of it, and in our case it's mostly been like lighthearted. Like, we weren't like, God, they promised Nora to be trans and now we're freaking out, right? Like, it's mostly been lighthearted in our case, but I can't say that we have never contributed to that. And so that's something that I've been trying to like advocate against very recently. You know, I saw this happen. I don't remember who it was exactly. So basically what happened is that a couple weeks ago, I think, somebody posted a screenshot of like, I don't remember who it was, but like somebody like from the crew liking their post, and they were like, guys, it's happening. Like, so-and-so liked this, it's happening. And I'm like, if you guys keep doing this, if you keep over-analyzing everything they like, right? Not even reply to everything they like on Twitter.com, first of all, right? We have been sort of fighting to get more interaction, because I will say, like, I feel like Miles and Carrie for a long time sort of reclused themselves from the fandom because of all of the hate that they were getting, right? And so I feel like that we have been like begging them to come out and talk to us, right? And then you have them that do, like, you have people in CRWBY that now do, like Eddie especially is very active on Twitter, and you're in his likes with a magnifying glass, and like he won't be able to interact with us anymore if you guys keep doing that. Like, none of them will. And so that's like the very first thing of like, if you overanalyze it to this extent, like they just won't be able to like live their lives and like stuff on Twitter or interact with the fandoms in the same way, right? And I feel like that those are connected, right? Like, they should be able to like something as in like, I like that thought, or I like how much thought you put into this, I like how much work you put into this theory, not that means the theory's true, right? And so that's something that I think that we need to do as a fandom. However, I think that there's a bigger conversation to be had here, and it's something I've noticed with like the radical few but loud Fairgame shippers. And this is not all Fairgame shippers, it's not all Crow and Clover fans, or fans of just Clover or just Crow. It is not all of them by any means. However, there's a specific type of harassment that is going on here that I feel like is deeply concerning, and we are not addressing for what it is. And I think that the biggest issue here is intersectionality. And basically, like, if you guys don't know what I mean exactly, it's basically like, you should not only care about the issues of the group that you specifically identify with, but rather recognize that all issues of marginalized people are interconnected in some way, and you should be advocating advocating for all of them. And so I think the best way to explain this, right, is, for example, there are feminists out there that only focus on the demographic that they identify with. And I'm comfortable with using this example because, like, I am white, right? So, like, a cis, white, like, woman only, like, tunnel visions on, like, their issues of being a cis white woman. But that is not true feminism, and that is not intersectionality. Like, intersectionality is considering, like, bi-POC women and trans women and other people in the LGBT community and disabled women, and considering all of these groups in your feminism, right? And so it's the same for LGBT issues. It's the same for all of these issues, that in whatever we advocate and fight for, we must have intersectionality. And I'm bringing this up because the biggest thing that I've seen throughout all of this discourse is this tunnel vision to only care about the MLM rep and to throw everything else that we have gotten in the trash under the bus. Well, your trans rep wasn't good actually, your Saffron and Tara, they're not good actually, your Bumblebee's not good actually, right? And so they are invalidating the rep that already exists and are basically saying, we don't care about this. We don't care about everything else that you have done. We just want what's ours, right? Like, that is basically the attitude, and I think that's such a damaging attitude to have, because it's not, again, it's not intersectional, and not even just that. Like, that is not what I think, like, being a part of, like, the LGBT community is. It's not just, like, thinking about yourself and your own rep, but it's also, like, being an ally for the other people that are in the same group as you. You have to also consider the history of the LGBT community and how other groups have oppressed other groups within the community, basically. Like, the relationship between, like, lesbian and gay people towards bi people, the relationship between cis people and trans people. You have to consider that. And so it makes me really, really uncomfortable that not OP, because the person that was asking the question to Kdin identifies differently, and so I don't want to lump them in or invalidate their identity with the group I'm talking about, but I'm more talking about, like, people I've seen on Twitter and stuff like that, right? So what I am saying is that there are a select few of these radical people that are cis gay men, and there's something about this that makes me deeply uncomfortable, given the dynamics in the community's, like, history, about them harassing a trans woman about her trans character and them invalidating the experience that she has had. And so I think that there's a very concerning dynamic with the people that are cis men, and again, like, not all of them, but specifically, like, that portion. There's something concerning to say there, that they seem to be fine with harassing, like, a trans woman who plays a trans character, right? Like, for the sake of this, like, white cis headcanoned gay, not actually gay men. And I think that there's a very, like, again, disturbing trend with what we've seen, where the female characters are sort of devalued in a way, like, for this one guy. We need to remember, like, what this show, like, is focusing on, and it is focusing on, like, the girls, like, on women, and a very, like, underrepresented, like, group in some senses in this way, right? And so I feel like that there's something very, like, about people devaluing the role that LGBT women play in the story just for this one guy. And so I feel like that people need to realize and refocus that this show is not about men. Like, the majority of the show is not, and that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be any representation in that department, but it does mean that to undervalue the representation that we already have, I think, is going against the show's whole premise in the first place, was to uplift, like, girls and, like, LGBT girls. But there's another layer to this, and you guys must be like, Cal, how many layers? There's actually another layer to this, because it isn't just about how, like, Clover is headcanon to be identified, I guess, but it's also about who Clover canonly was. Like, I find it deeply concerning that people don't seem to have a problem with, like, the rep that they are advocating for was the cop bootlicker, right? That was an active oppressor and, like, drank all of Ironwood's Kool-Aid. And so that personally makes me, like, really, guys, like, this is the rep you want? Because, again, that is not intersectionality. And you have people that'll put, like, oh, like, the all cops are bastards, or, like, Black Lives Matter in their bio, but then are, like, licking Clover's boot. And what was so funny was that I think it was the person that originally replied to Kdin, they said that Kdin was a bootlicker for Miles and Carrie. And what's so funny, in such an awful and unlike self-aware way, like, they have zero self-awareness, that they will call Kdin a bootlicker, but ignore the fact that the character that they wanted to be, like, the MLM rep is an oppressive force. Like, why would you want that? Like, especially, again, with the history of cops in the LGBT community, but also cops in other marginalized communities, right? Like, think about who Clover's actively oppressing and what Ironwood, like, who he's actively oppressing right now, and you want him to be the gay rep? Like, that's what I don't understand. understand. And some people will be like, but Clover wasn't really like that. They forced him to be that way. And you know, like if you ship it in fan fiction, if you make an AU where he did defect and all that stuff, like I'm a believer that you can write anything well. Like you can write a reality where Clover defected and it can be the most well-written like piece of art like ever seen or put on fanfiction.net or whatever, right? I have no problem with the art or the shipping it like in concept because I thought it was cute. Hunter and I were gunning for it for a while, but then the problematic aspects of it started to set in, and it doesn't matter what you thought Clover like could be in this alternate universe. The reality is that the Clover that was the highest on the Kool-Aid. You have Ironwood, Clover, Hare, Vine, Elm, and Marrow, right? Clover is not like Marrow, and so it kind of baffles me why people are like, no, like how could you do this, right? Because Clover was the worst out of all of them, where Marrow has the chance to defect. That was never in the cards for Clover. It was never hinted at or written, and like you can even say this, like with Marrow, I think there was always the indication that he was hesitant, right? And then if you look at even other characters like Emerald, like some people are like, why is Emerald getting a redemption arc? Because she was always the hesitant one, right? Even back in Volume 2, she was the hesitant one, right? Same with Hazel. Like Hazel was always like, I don't want unnecessary violence, right? He was always the one on that sort of teeter-totter, on the tightrope, right? Where he could like flip like, you know, to the other side, right? And Clover was never like that. So that's really what baffles me, is that people are advocating for this bootlicking cop, right? And all the real world, like, you know, implications of like these oppressive systems and all that stuff. And that's what, like, that's who they wanted to be the rep. And I think that's very concerning, especially like the people that are treating it as some like, you know, like precious soft boy Clover thing, when Clover like was actively an oppressor. And I think that this conversation again would be better suited coming from a POC person, right? And I would totally encourage anyone to make their own video about this, because I think that's a perspective the community lacks a lot of the time. I tried to talk to some people and see what they thought about it, and they basically have the same like dumbfounded thing as I do, right? Like especially like there are a couple people like that I'm really close friends with that are Black, right? And they're looking at this and they're like, Clover, the bootlicking cop, why? And they're also gay. And so it's just like, it's one of those things where it's like they are completely baffled, but that's a nuance that the Fairgame situation like seems to be missing. And I feel like that, again, like it's a lacking of this intersectionality, right? You guys are gonna be sick of that word by the time I say it, but I'm just so heated about the fact that like nobody apparently recognizes that. And to me, if Clover had lived, and I don't think that he would have defected, right? Like if Clover had lived and not defected and was gay, he would be bad rep. I don't know if anybody else realizes that, right? Or if they're just so focused, again, on their own group that they can't think about the implications of that. Clover, as a cop, as an oppressive force that stays by Ironwood's side, would be bad rep. And I don't know why nobody realizes that, right? So I guess in closing, here's what I'm personally hoping, right? I do think that we need more MLM rep in the show, but I think that Clover was not it. Like, Clover was not the rep. I think instead, like, Crow, I think would be really good rep, depending on what he starts to do, right? Depending on what he's doing. I don't really, you know, we don't know where his character arc is going, but hopefully it's going to a, like, not bad Crow place, right? And, like, that's the other thing that Hunter actually mentioned. Like, it's also difficult when you have a situation where, like, all gay characters need to be, like, perfect, like, absolutely perfect, no character flaw. So even if Crow does do something, like, bad in terms of, like, he does kill Ironwood, right? We can debate whether that's actually bad or not, but he does something like that. I wouldn't necessarily say that that makes him bad rep because, like, he was, you know, killing the oppressor instead of causing more oppression, right? But I think that, you know, like, bisexual Crow, I think, would be a good, like, option to go towards, and I think that we will have a lot of rep when we get to Vacuo. And again, I don't want to overhype people just in another direction, right? But based on what I have read in the book, I feel like that it could be a possibility that they are doing something very gay with Theodore. Theodore seems like a very, like, multifaceted character. He has a lot of, like, layers to him. Like, yes, he's, like, theatrical and, like, he's, like, confident and, like, positive and enthusiastic, but he's also very cautious, and he doesn't want to make the mistakes of the other headmasters, right? And so there's a lot of layers to Theodore. If he's not evil, I think that he's, like, a great, like, very nuanced character already, even though we haven't seen him, right? And I'm not trying to hype you guys up in one way or the other, right? Like, I'm not just trying to throw you, like, look over there. There's something that could happen, like, in order to distract you. But instead, I hope that I'm giving people some hope, because I think that where, like, Clover really fails, Theodore could really succeed. you know, in a relationship with Crow, or just like succeed as representation in general. And I think in the case of Crow, right, like again, like I mentioned, Theodore is confident and enthusiastic and very like a positive person, and that could be really good for Crow's energy as well. And so we'll have to wait and see. But I would say that, again, like, even without Theodore, there's still, you know, Team Coffee, and there's still Team Sun, and there are, like, canonly gay male characters in Vacuo. There is hope, and I think that they will put the effort into putting that same love and care to the characters when we get to Vacuo. That is basically, like, how I'd like to end this. Again, you know, Hunter and I did this video together, but it just didn't turn out because of like the recording files and stuff like that. So hopefully this one does. And those are our thoughts, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye.